All right, man, peace. So as most of you brothers that follow the NBA most likely know, the NBA All-Star Game is taking place in Charlotte, North Carolina this upcoming weekend. And of course, that means that the host of the NBA All-Star Game and all the festivities surrounding it is going to be none other than Mr. Michael Jordan. Now, the NBA All-Star Game was supposed to take place in Charlotte a couple of years ago, but due to the controversy surrounding the transgender bathroom bill law, Adam Silver, the super wokety-woke Caucasian liberal Jew commissioner of the NBA, decided that he was not going to allow the All-Star Game festivities there until Carolina, quote-unquote, got their act together. Well, Michael Jordan was able to appease Adam Silver and have the festivities return to Charlotte, North Carolina, and he sat down for a press conference. And I realized that's the only way that you're going to get Michael Jordan to sit down for a press conference or an interview, is to make sure that he has something to gain from it. And he's earned that. And it was very clear to me as I watched the press conference that he made sure that the press knew to not ask him any questions about LeBron James. Well, he was asked questions about Russell Westbrook and James Harden. And he answered honestly after first injecting some fluff as a precursor to try to soften the blow. So anyway, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
But you know MJ is incapable of speaking without that competitive spirit coming out.
Or just telling the truth.
So when he was asked which streak was more impressive to him, James Harden's 30 straight games with at least 30 points.
Let me say something very quickly about James Harden. And I'm sure that he has a lot of fans out there. His game to me is very ugly. How he plays is not appealing at all. There's nothing against the brother. He's very talented for what he does. But this notion that this streak of 30-point games is so impressive, I believe that there are probably 10 to 15 players who could do what he's doing right now if he had the green light that he's been given by the coach of that team, D'Antoni. I have very little doubt about that. There are probably 3 players on the Golden State Warriors right now who could score 30 points in 30 straight games if they had the green light to just take as many bad shots as he takes per game. No disrespect to him. He's a great player, at least a great offensive player. First ballot Hall of Famer, no doubt about it. But he's so concerned about this point scoring streak, and he made it very, very obvious in the game against Denver a couple of weeks ago when they were down by over 20 points with about 2.5 minutes left, and he comes back in the game to keep his 30-point streak going. That should show you right there what he's actually about as a player.
Or Russell Westbrook's 10 straight triple-doubles. Here was Michael Jordan's response.
Both. They all both hard, and uniquely, it shows the talent, that we have within the league. It shows still the progression within the league. I'm very proud about what both guys have done because they're making their mark for the league, and I think it really helps the growth of the league, which is harder from a player standpoint. 6 championships by all means.
Why did I do that close-up on Michael's face? Why did I do that close-up like that? So that we could see them damn shopping bags under his eyes. I don't need to see all that shit. We already know that Michael's going to end his commentary by telling the bitter cold truth about both Russell Westbrook and James Harden. That being that they're both very talented individual players, but it's very obvious that they're stat chasing. Mike really wants to say nigga please.
And that's why he's the GOAT. Amazing. By the way, you guys love the face he made in the middle of that?
Mike.
Yeah. He wasn't he wasn't real on that one.
Of course he wasn't, but he knew that he had to soften it up, because if he said what he really felt, then he looked like a quote-unquote hater. That being that both those streaks are manufactured, especially in this NBA. I mean, James Harden, he'd be a very effective scorer back in the 80s and 90s. Don't get it twisted. He'd be very effective. But averaging 37 points a game, James Harden, no way. No way. He wouldn't be explosive enough. He wouldn't be able to finish over the power forwards and the centers that existed back in the 80s and 90s when you didn't have stretch 4s and 5s. It makes it so much easier to score that amount of points per game today when you have your defender on an island and they cannot impede your penetration.
All that praise at the beginning was just the stuff he was supposed to say, all of that. I mean, look, obviously, the answer to any argument is 6 championships, right? And will be for a long time. But we've been having this conversation off camera a lot. Tracy, you and I and Kobe had it a little bit before we sat down last week about sort of where stats are right now and whether we're pretty...
Stats are inflated. They're not as highly inflated as people make them out to be, but they are relatively inflated.
We're putting too much weight on them, and the fact that stats are, I mean, they're different than they used to be, right?
They are, because of the rule changes of today's game. No hand checking. There's a lot in favor for the offensive player.
Absolutely, and let me say this. Tracy McGrady played in the most defensive era in NBA history. A lot of people do not grasp that. I have certain brothers who get upset when I say those things because they keep trying to mythologize the 1980s. The 1980s was not a defensive era. I repeat, the 1980s was not a defensive era. It was not. So cats need to stop saying that. It may have been more physical, meaning they may have been allowed to take more cheap shots and just hit you for the sake of hitting you. But it was not a defensive era. The NBA started to get more and more defensive starting in the late 80s, going into the 90s. And then when Jordan retired in 93, it got very defensive to the point where David Stern, he started to panic and he brought in the three-point line after 94. That's why the three-point line was brought in, because after Jordan retired in 93, the NBA probably had the lowest offensive efficiency numbers that it had had in its history, or at least in the relatively modern era since like the late 50s, early 60s. Well, you had teams shooting low percentages and it just was not that exciting. It culminated in the 7-game series between the Rockets and the Knicks that did not draw huge ratings, did not draw good ratings at all. Of course, Jordan comes back the next season from his imposed exile or his willful retirement, whatever you choose to believe. And in 95, he was just getting his bearings together. The next season, the line was still in, and the league was still defensive in the 95-96 season, all the way pretty much until the early 2000s. The NBA was very defensive, and then it started to crawl out of it with the Mike D'Antoni Phoenix Suns of the mid-2000s. But the league was very defensive, especially in the McGrady, Paul Pierce era. That's why you'll see all the great scorers in like 2000, 2001, 2002. All those guys were shooting 42, 43%, all of them. McGrady, Paul Pierce, Vince Carter, Kobe was shooting maybe like 45%. But he had Shaq, so he never really got double teamed back then. And I'm sure that many of Kobe's fans will get upset. Yes, he was. Kobe was triple teamed, even with Shaq. No, he wasn't. But most of your prominent scorers in that era, if you did not have a big man to help you, you were shooting about 41, 42, 43%.
And these guys are so skilled at what they do. You're talking about James Harden, probably the best offensive player, one-on-one player in our game.
Well, he's right there. Him and Kyrie. Even though I think that Kyrie's game is much cleaner than James Harden's. I think that James Harden gets away with a lot.
If you can't touch him or impede his progress, and as far as him taking all these threes and you can't come down in his space, how do you contest a jump shot that he's really good at doing? That's how he gets to the free throw line a lot. These guys takes a lot of shots from the outside, and he goes to the free throw line a lot because of this.
Wilt Chamberlain was the greatest pure athlete in the history of the NBA. He probably was the greatest pure athlete of the 20th century.
I don't think these guys are capable of doing this in the era that we played in.
Hell no.
Or Michael Jordan's era.
Absolutely not.
It was too tough. It was too tough of defensive purposes and just the...
Well, not only that, because... Again, the difference in defense is a little bit overrated, just a little bit. Of course, the defenses were tougher back then. But what truly made it tougher to score back in the Jordan era and even the Kobe McGrady era was the fact that your 4-man and your 5-man was in the lane. So if you wanted to score, you had to score with mid-range jump shots and turnaround jump shots, fadeaways, or threes. It was very difficult to get to the basket back then with the 4-man and the 5-man there waiting for you in the lane.
Just the players that they played against was a lot, focused in on trying to shut this guy down, teams trying to shut a guy down. I don't think, guys are capable of putting up these type of numbers.
When I first thought about, do we put enough emphasis or too much emphasis on stats? At first I was like, no, because if we did, why don't we always come back to like Wilt's numbers?
Right.
We never like bring that up. Like,
Right, but when she says that you're not putting more of an emphasis on stats, she's talking about over the last 3 or 4 years. She's not talking about going back to Wilt Chamberlain, Paul Pierce.
Like, he averaged 50 points, 20 rebounds, and he's never in that discussion for the GOAT.
Well, he was the tallest person.
I mean, you can't help when he was...
I've had people come on my channel and state that Wilt Chamberlain is the greatest basketball player of all time, and I just can't call him that. He's the greatest physical specimen, the greatest athlete in the history of the NBA, and as I've stated, most likely in the history of sports, maybe. But certainly of the 20th century. This dude was 7'2", with about a 45-inch vertical leap. Like, he easily could take a coin off the top of the backboard with no problem. Was a world-class track and field star, great race car driver, tennis player, volleyball player, so on and so forth.
Was born and what era he played in. I mean, you can't fast forward. I mean, all the records, it's like everybody's constantly chasing Wilt.
Right.
But we never mention him as the GOAT.
Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that...
That's because Wilt's career is looked at as being a bit underwhelming. For someone who put up all of the gargantuan stats that he put up, he was only able to win 2 championships. It just happened to be that the 2 championships that he won were on 2 of the teams that were recognized as possibly being the greatest teams of all time. I believe that he won in '67 with Philadelphia, and that team broke the record for most wins in a season. I believe they won something like 66 or 67 games, or 68 games, I think it was. And then he goes to the Lakers, and in '72 they win 69 games, and they held the record for most wins in a season all the way until 1996 when the Bulls broke it. But that's where Wilt's career is very strange, because even though he put up all those tremendous numbers, his teams tended to underwhelm in the playoffs. And for a very long time, until Jordan, he held the record for most points per game. But in the playoffs, he only averaged about 22 points a game. So in the big spot, he tended to underwhelm. That's why I call LeBron James the modern-day Wilt Chamberlain, because LeBron James for a very long time was like that. Now, he seemed to have cracked the code on how to dominate in the playoffs. But for a long period of time, LeBron James was known for underwhelming in the playoffs, even though he would put up big numbers. But as an archetype, LeBron is today's Wilt, physically dominant over everyone. But for whatever reason, he just cannot dominate in the finals.
It's that this season, the 2 guys who are knocking on the door...
Or at least his teams cannot dominate in the finals.
The door for records are knocking on Wilt Chamberlain's records, right? It's not like 20 years ago someone was going to knock down one of Wilt's records and then now it's another one of Wilt's records. It's that, look, the pace of play was a lot different back then, so they had more trips up and down the basketball court so they could put up more numbers, and then it slowed down, and then now it is obviously sped up again, and also, as Tracy says, some of the rules and rule emphasis changes have been different, so the point totals we're seeing come back up, and that's why you're kind of getting back to that era of, you're kind of getting back to a comparison where you're comparing...
Well, no matter what they do with the rules, not in my lifetime would another player score 100 points.
And you still don't think that's going to happen?
I don't think...
Yeah, that's not going to happen. No.
I don't think that's going to happen.
I mean, Kobe had 81.
I don't know. I was talking to Kobe last night. I actually think in today's game, Kobe probably could score 100 points.
I think that Kobe Bryant could have a game today where he took 70 or 75 shots. And maybe he can get 100 points on 75 shots. If Kobe were to score 100 points in a game today, it would have to probably come in 2 or 3 overtimes. That's how that would have to come. Because, I mean, let's be for real. If you go back and you look at that 81-point game, the defense played by the Raptors in that game was no better than the defense played today. That's what I mean when I say sometimes people try to exaggerate the effectiveness of the defense in their era. There were bad defensive teams in every era. I don't care what you name. And the Raptors were a bad defensive team that season, and Kobe Bryant took advantage of it. As well as just, somebody turned his Kundalini energy all the way up that night, because that also happened to be his 666th game, for those of you who don't know.
So this is interesting.
I don't think in our lifetime, maybe he could, though. Maybe he could, but I'm just saying now,
So he thinks
nobody...
he would?
I think he could.
Right. So, look, when we were sitting down, we were putting out Harden's 30-point scoring streak, right, which has now reached 30 games. Before this, the only two guys in the modern era to ever do it were you and Kobe. You had 14 and Kobe had 16. The fact that it never even got close to 30, where James Harden is now, I think maybe speaks to era, because I would certainly, you could have your argument about James Harden and Kobe, but you can't say that James Harden is twice as good as Kobe Bryant. So.
James Harden twice as good as Kobe Bryant. And everybody knows that when it comes to Kobe, I scrutinize his career. Many of his fans get upset with me. But Kobe Bryant is one of the top 15 players to ever play. James Harden is not. Right now, I would say that James Harden is probably top 60. But top 15, no. Nowhere near. He's a great offensive player for this era. For this era, he's a great offensive player. And in any era, he'd be borderline great. He'd be very good offensively in any era because of his handle, his physique, what he could do. He could take a bump. He can get into traffic and finish in traffic. He's just not that explosive. So back in the 90s, per se, if he would have faced the Indiana Pacers, the New York Knicks, or the Miami Heat in the playoffs, he'd probably shoot somewhere around 40% and average around 21, 22 points a game against teams like that, because they body him up. So he would have to develop a post-up game. Great offensive players in that era, you had to have a post-up game, because you had to turn your back to your opponent, because they were allowed to be very physical with you and put hands on you. Also, turning your back to them would allow you to see your shooters easier, especially if they move without the basketball. In this era, he could face up all day because they really can't get near him.
And so, therefore, there has to be some, and for me, the statistical sort of emphasis isn't as much on like, hey, are we comparing this era to this era? I just think we have so many stats now, we have advanced stats, and they're helpful, and they really have given us a better idea of sort of the worth and contributions some people are making on the court.
I would love to have seen Russell Westbrook go up against Gary Payton. Oh, man. That would have been a hell of a matchup.
Opened our eyes to things that people are doing that might not show up in those original maybe 5 or 6 categories of stats, but they still don't show everything. And stats don't show all the defensive contributions they don't show the leadership contributions people make. So when we get into the MVP discussion and we get into sort of who's the best player discussion, sometimes I think we over-rely on stats when...
Yes, the reason why you're saying that is because you see that James Harden's stats are going to overwhelm your boothing LeBron James. Because last season, you were trying to use stats as your defense for why LeBron James deserved the MVP award. The MVP is not that difficult to figure out. It's always been the same thing. It's the best player on a team that either has the most wins or is competing for the most wins, and he not only had a great season, but he had a transcendent season. That's always been who the MVP was. So why certain people are trying to act like there's this conundrum on how to decipher or discern who the MVP is, it's very clear that there's an agenda. Because the MVP has never been about who the best player was. It's always been about who's having the best season on the best team, particularly if that season is transcendent.
When they tell us a lot more than they used to, but they don't tell us everything.
I look at James Harden streak, it's very impressive. If you look at his usage rate, it's extremely high.
Thank you, sir.
If you look at the amount of three-pointers he take, it's extremely high.
And that's what confounds stat geeks like Max Kellerman. Because he'll actually get on TV and claim that James Harden is efficient because he's taking mostly three-point shots. Like, that's a way to contrive efficiency. True efficiency is how many shots you make divided by how many shots you take. Now, when you have stat geeks, they'll say, well, because the three-point shot weighs differently, it's more important to look at the quote-unquote true shooting percentage. That's how people like James Harden are able to get by as being shot jackers, because they know that in their offense, he's told to just take as many threes as possible because a three is a heavier shot than a two-point shot.
More than I've taken, Kobe's taken, MJ's taken, ever in our careers. I think he's probably at like averaging 13 threes. You probably only averaged 4 threes in your career. I averaged probably...
Attempts.
Yeah, attempts. 5.
Maybe at the most. Because in their era, it was very rare for players to even take 4 three-point shots a game.
5. So I look at him from his perspective. I mean, he should put up these type of numbers.
Absolutely.
If he's taken that many shots, the usage rate, he should put up. As far as Russ's numbers, averaging a triple-double. Now, that to me is the hardest. But then if you look at the possessions, the amount of possessions in today's game, if you look at offensive rebounds. You get offensive rebound. There's 14 seconds on the shot clock, not 24.
Right.
So that
speed that up.
If you speed the game is sped up, so it's going to be a lot more.
Because you got at that size, you got to get the rebounds, and then you got to make plays. So I think that's hard to compare to see which one is more difficult.
So I was just told I average.
Well, Russell Westbrook is having the more impactful season in my view because just mentally he's come to understand that he's not on an even playing field with Paul George when it comes to scoring. He's finally come to terms with that because he struggled with that when he had Kevin Durant. And now that he understands that Paul George should be averaging at least 6 to 7 more points per game than him, that's made the team much better.
I averaged 4 attempts. You averaged 3 attempts on your threes. Imagine you, career-wise, imagine you taking 13 threes.
13 threes.
Imagine the points that you would average. And you was a guy that got to the free throw line as well.
Right. It'll be different.
Oh, no. Paul Pierce will dominate today. He dominates today. Because if you can't walk up on him and all he has to do is square up and pull up for 3, he definitely would dominate. He was a streak shooter and a streak scorer. He was somebody that if he got hot, he can give you 45. But he also was in an era where you had to have a dominant post-up game.
It'll be different, definitely, this year.
Would have been very different. Now, I've always thought that Russ, the fact that when he has a triple-double, the Thunder usually win. I think that correlation matters. So
I agree with that, and that's very valid. Because when Westbrook does get triple-doubles, his team is something like 50 games over 500.
So it doesn't bother me because I always hunted. But Scottie Pippen was on our show on Friday, and he really shared some similar thoughts to his old teammate, Michael Jordan. Remember what he said?
I just don't think that it's organic anymore. We watch.
It's definitely not organic. In other words, what Pippen is saying is that these players are very cognizant of how many rebounds and assists they have, and they're going for it. And that's not to say that players who would get a lot of triple-doubles back in the 80s, like a Larry Bird and a Magic Johnson, that they were not aware. But the players today are so much more aware, and I think a lot of it has to do with TV. And, they watch these shows and all these stats and these graphics showing how many triple-doubles such and such player has, and they go for it.
Watch Russell play when he lost KD, and it was really about watching it happen organically.
Right.
Yes, he did exert himself in a few games to make sure he had the stats, but now it's just not real.
He's saying it's not real because Russ is forcing to?
Well, he said that he...
Yes. Yes, that's what he's saying.
That he's sort of stat hunting, that Russ always knows how many he needs to kind of finish each category, and that he'll, I think last night, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but he needed a certain number of assists in the last like 5 minutes or something of the game, and then he's...
And even Paul George is on record because Paul George just had a game where he had a triple-double along with Russ's triple-double. And Paul George stated that Russell Westbrook came over to him and said, "You're only 1 assist away from a triple-double. I'll help you out." So that just shows you how triple-double conscious Russell Westbrook is, and I don't mind that because Russell wants to be remembered. He knows that he may not ever win a championship, so he'll be remembered as a triple-double guy.
And then he suddenly got them and that kind of thing. So he thinks he's stat hunting.
But they're winning.
That's always my answer. My answer is always like, right, but they're winning when he does
You
it.
win the game.
Right.
If, like, the coach told Mac, like, every time you go over 25, Mac, we win.
Right.
You think he's not going to go
You gotta
for
go
it?
get
Right.
25.
I mean, that's just what it is.
Right.
I mean, yeah, he may be stat hunting, but usually when he does that, the results are great.
Also, if it was easy, everyone would do it, right? And so,
Well, nobody's saying that Russell Westbrook is not tremendously talented. That's why I call him a force of nature. But still, he plays outside of the natural flow to try to make sure that he gets his numbers. I mean, it is what it is. You need players like that in every era because everybody can't be a winner. Everybody can't win championships. So different players, they bring different wrinkles, like Reggie Miller and Patrick Ewing and, Karl Malone, David Robinson. Prior to David getting Tim Duncan, of course, they were known as players who just added wrinkles across the NBA. You felt like they could threaten for a title, but you never thought that they were going to be able to overcome Jordan.
The fact that he's only the only one in the NBA doing it matters to me as well. Michael.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. I like what Michael, T-Mac, and Pippen had to say about Russell Westbrook and James Harden because they provided context. So peace.